Hey there. Happy story time with Dr. Bird. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar. And I'm really interested in marriage in the Bible right now. That's kind of my main focus at the moment, though I enjoy having all kinds of conversations about critical thinking, meeting reading the Bible. So any passage is up for scrutiny, in my opinion. But I happen to be doing a bit of an experiment for the month of June. It is June 23rd. So, for another week at least, where I'm reading through biblical, reading through books of the Bible and looking at passages that relate to or talk about sex, the relationships we call marriage. I put in air quotes because ancient concepts of marriage are very different from modern concepts. And that's one of the reasons I think this is an important conversation to have. And also potentially stories that involve physical harm uh, involving intimate body parts. So I do have a book coming out this fall. You can pre-order it already on Amazon or the publisher's website if you're interested in it. And um, so I'm doing this kind of a thing, kind of little experiment to highlight how much of the Bible actually pertains to this conversation. That people tend to be taught certain passages and, in a sense, are taught to overlook or not pay attention to the amount of content that actually does pertain to this conversation, as well as the amount of content that is harmful or unhealthy, setting bad examples, whatever. Take your pick on all of that. Okay. So let's get a little. Here we are doing a little story time. And we wrapped up the book of Genesis essentially yesterday. There weren't many things in pertaining to my particular focus in the last 5 chapters. So we talked about Joseph's story. We also talked a little bit on a couple different episodes about the fact that there might be something in Jacob and Joseph, in terms of the way they're depicted, for members of the LGBTQ plus community to champion, which is not an angle that I hear talked about much. I think it's a fascinating angle because of how important Jacob ends up being in the biblical storyline as the man who is renamed Israel and therefore is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, more or less. Um, one of the tribes is split into two for Ephraim and Manasseh, but you know, uh, yeah, I just think it's kind of interesting, right? That Christian traditions have had a hard time embracing LGBTQ folks, and this is a reality. This is an element of human reality that has always been a part of human reality. It's not like this is something that's just recently developed, right? This is a part of who we are as collectives, as humans. And I find it really fun and interesting that we have the father of one of the main patriarchs is being depicted in ways that suggest that he was not a highly testosterone driven male, and that Jacob himself may have been a bit more what we would call effeminate because he's different from his fraternal twin brother Esau, who was very and a hunter and very hairy and very all that, right? It's great. I love the spectrum. I love the variety of human, realities. And what a fun thing to just kind of take that up. So I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I don't know if there are dissertations out there on this topic of championing Jacob as I don't know, a gay man or a highly effeminate, who knows what he actually desired sexually, man, right? But wouldn't that be nice if the faith traditions could embrace the realities of human embodiment? And that might be one way for people to do that, as well as Joseph. So Jacob acknowledging his youngest son Joseph is maybe similar to him in that way, and maybe that's one of the reasons he's his favorite son. Like, I don't know. There's all kinds of possibilities here, right? So anyway, so that was kind of the fun part at the end of Genesis for me, was bantering about the depiction according to the narrative itself, right? If you just pay close attention. Very fun to see that in the scriptures. I'm not trying to make something definitive of it. I'm simply highlighting that it's there. And again, I'm going to refer to my friend Peterson Toscano's piece, his video. It's about 45 minutes long, I think, 45, 50 minutes total, maybe an hour. Transfigurations, transgressing gender in the Bible. And he simply reads, he does close readings of texts, and then he embodies a character as he reads it. Not, he's not having to bring a whole lot to the story. He's simply fleshing out what he's seeing in the storyline. And I find it actually rather freeing to see Peterson's work in this kind of a way. I brought him to one of the institutions where I was teaching when I first met him and saw the work he was doing. Peterson is now a climate has changed activist. But his work, his biblical engagement is still out there. So I like to tell people about it because I think it's really quite inspiring and encouraging for lots of people. So that was my long intro to say, now we're going to switch over to a different book. And there was a question this week. Someone commented about why, the genealogy in Matthew, the genealogy for Jesus in Matthew, it is different from the genealogy in Luke, by the way. If you're interested, that's a fun thing to look at in parallel. The lineage in Matthew is different than the lineage in Luke. Let me just touch on that very briefly because that's what we're going to look at here in Matthew. So it's one of the things that actually I could spend an hour in a classroom with students. I have a handout that has the lineage in Matthew and then the lineage in Luke. I know that sounds ridiculously boring, but it's actually quite interesting when you look at it. And looking at the, Matthew starts with Abraham and goes all the way and works its way to Joseph, who is the adopted father of Jesus. And that was where the crux of the question came in. Why does Matthew's genealogy spend so much time showing us that Jesus, showing us this connection to Judaism or to, Jewishness in the first century, when he's not even technically Joseph's son? It's a very good question. And that's what we're going to talk about here. But I also want to highlight that Luke's genealogy starts with Jesus and works backwards and goes way beyond Abraham to Seth and Adam, son of God. So there's a different thing going on there, even in the genealogies, which is an element of talking about the Gospels themselves, right? The Gospel writers are doing different things. They're not all witnessing the same car crash and telling 4 different angles on the same car crash. No, that's an analogy I hear all the time from people. And it's an analogy I understand, but it's not really what's going on. The 4 gospel writers are writing at different points in time. So mid 60s for Mark, mid 80s for Matthew, a few more years later Luke, and then mid 90s for John. They're not, we're talking about they are reflecting changes in thought or developments of thought that need to be accommodated, all kinds of things. There isn't a genealogy. There isn't even a birth narrative in Mark. This is worth noting, right? John is not even doing a genealogy at all. John is doing a whole cosmic thing because John is trying to depict Jesus. John's the one gospel we get Jesus's divinity from. So even the opening scenes, right? These opening ideas that we get in the Gospels direct us to the essence or the point that each gospel writer is trying to depict. So you can get a decent dose of what the gospel writers are trying to depict when you look at the genealogies, right? Luke's gospel is trying to connect Jesus to all of humankind instead of just to Judaism, which is an interesting thing to talk about. But Matthew's Jesus is very Jewish. In fact, Matthew bends over backwards to show how Jesus is connected to his Jewish heritage. And he does it by quoting out of context dozens of times biblical passages, mostly from the prophets, and a few maybe from the writings. So maybe from the Psalms and other passages, but it's predominantly from the prophets that Matthew quotes biblical passages out of context and says, see, Jesus is adding the story about Jesus is adding meaning to this ancient claim that was made, or this ancient text that is part of this Jewish tradition. Another way that Matthew, the gospel writer of Matthew, shows Jesus's connection to his Jewishness is in this genealogy. So it is different than Luke's genealogy. There are more people listed in Luke's genealogy, even in just the numbers up to Abraham. So we have 14 generations from Abraham to David. We have 14 generations in Matthew, 14 from David to the deportation into Babylon, and 13 from Babylon to Joseph. That's what, 42-ish, 41. In Luke, there are more names listed working their way back up to Abraham than there are in Matthew. So they're not working with the same lists. I am never bringing up a contradiction in scripture as a way to say, see, it's not accurate. That's not my thing. And actually, it's important to me that you know that. It's actually just the opposite. Let's be honest about what it's actually doing. They are doing different things. They're working with different traditions, whatever it is. Let's be honest about that so that we can look at what's actually going on, right? So I feel like I sent myself on a tangent that I didn't mean to do. I'm going to do story time now. And even though it may seem strange to read a genealogy, I'm going to encourage you, as you're listening, if you're going to hang in there with me on this, does anything stand out to you about this? Especially since I keep commenting on how overwhelmingly frustrating and annoying it is that all of these genealogies and all of the things, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Not Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah, or even just Jacob and Rachel and Leah. Like, it's never an honest representation of the people, the couples that produce the children. It's always talking about the men, right? And both genealogies in Matthew and Luke are talking about the men, except for so I just want to highlight that, like, pay attention to what stands out. And if you're here with me live, I'm going to keep the comments open so I can see if you have some comments or questions, kind of make this as much of an exchange as I can. To banter with you about this. I'm going to read the genealogy, and then we're going to read part of the section that comes right after that. It actually can be quite interesting. So here's a little story time. Matthew chapter 1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's a big jump, right? What's he highlighting, right? I need to stop. I need to focus on sex, marriage, the other thing. I can't help it. I just went into like New Testament scholar mode, and I'm trying to teach you everything instead of focusing on the point. Okay, keep going. Here we go. Abraham was the father of Isaac, right? Of course he was. And there was a woman involved, but we're not going to talk about we're not going to tell you about all of the women, apparently, right? And that's my point in doing this series. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. What? And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. Hello. We've just named 3 women. What's going on? And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So we're going to come back to all this. I'm not going to talk about it right now. I want to get through the genealogy and then we'll come back. So put a pin in that. And David, so that we had just had 14 generations. And David was the father of. So I'm just going to comment, right? The father of, no reference to the women involved. It's like it's happening magically, all of that, right? And David was the father of Solomon by the wife, actually, I know that the Greek here says by she of Uriah. And I'm raising my hand because my English says the wife of Uriah, right? not the language being used in the Greek. And Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam, the father of Abijah, and Abijah, the father of Asaph, and Asaph, and the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat, the father of Joram, and Joram, the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah, the father of Jotham, and Jotham, the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Two Manassehs in this family, and Manasseh, the fame of Amos, and Amos, the father of Josiah, and Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations there. And after the deportation to Babylon, dun dun dun, Jeconiah was the father of Salaltiel, and Salaltiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim. I shift back and forth between Greek, like which way would it be pronounced in Hebrew, Greek, and English? Okay. Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matan. Hang in there with me, we're almost there. And Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the man, my English says husband, the man of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So we didn't just actually say who Jesus's father was, or is, or was at the time. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. It's actually 13, but that doesn't matter. Again, I never point out inaccuracies to say the Bible is wrong. I point them out to say there are errors and or misrepresentations or whatever, and it happens, and it's good to be aware of instead of claiming that everything's peachy keen. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this genealogy right here. I'm going to look to see. I disregard the Bible completely. I don't blame you. Not trying to say you should regard it, but for those who do, I think it's good to have this kind of thing going on. I'm compelled to understand this stuff for what it is. Zodiac is more credible. Okay. Just joined. Are we skipping Jose and Gomer? No, considering anew. I just needed to punt last minute, and someone had raised a question about the genealogy. I'm going to go back to the Hebrew Bible. I just decided to run with something that was in my back pocket today. And probably going to go through Matthew and hit the highlights that are relevant to this particular series. And then we'll go back to, so no, don't worry. We're not skipping Hosea. We're going to go back, which means I'm going to carry on beyond June, I suppose is what that means. So thanks for that question. Okay, what else? Okay, that's you all are chatting, which is so lovely. Okay, great. So back to the story time. Okay, so there's a really fascinating thing going on here. So there were 4 women named in this genealogy. Did you notice that? We have Tamar, and that was the story we talked about. That's from Genesis chapter 38. Right? The woman who is procured for Judah's oldest son, right? And he dies without children. And remember that awful little story about how the only way to explain someone dying, just young or whatever unexpectedly is by he must be evil, and God zapped him dead on the spot. And then his brother Onan was supposed to perform the duty of a brother-in-law, whatever that means in their context, not to marry her, not to take her, but to give her children that would be Er's children. He dies for pulling out early every time. God strikes him dead. And then the Christian tradition, at least, I hear that it's not a thing in the Jewish tradition, or at least not that I've encountered, might be somewhere, but lots of Christians are told that this is why God says masturbation is a sin, when it's not even masturbation. Anyway, that's Tamar. And then she's not given to the third brother. And so Judah has put her in a difficult situation, and she sets herself up in such a way as to get his attention, and as well as his semen within her. And she gets pregnant by her father-in-law, right? By Judah. Okay, so those children are claimed by Judah. They are his. And instead of giving them to his son, which is also kind of interesting, right? But anyway, Tamar is mentioned is the point. Why is Tamar mentioned? She is a Canaanite. She is not an Israelite. We don't mention women in any genealogies. The 76 generations that are delineated in Luke include no women whatsoever, right? So this isn't like some sort of egalitarian thing. Not at all. I do not think so. If it were, we'd have all the women's names. No, I think this is really, really interesting. We have Tamar, then we have Rahab, who was at the very least a madam, right? Running a brothel, maybe a sex worker herself, moved up from it to being running the whole thing. I don't know. But she's involved in sex work. Let's just be clear about that. Because that's where the two spies in Joshua go when they're sent to get the lay of the land. That never gets old. I don't know why. I feel like I'm a teenager every time I say that, being ridiculous about a sex pun. But anyway, when they're sent to go spy out the land and get, see what's going on. And the narrative tells us they go to see a sex worker. I mean, come on. So many things about that are fun. Why would they go to a sex worker to get the scoop? Right? Because you can get the scoop. Like the people working there, right? They hear things because apparently people tend to treat sex workers like they're not actually fully human, and they tell them things or they feel safe with them because they're aware of whatever, the full range of human, whatever. And people end up, telling priests and sex workers all kinds of stuff. You know what I'm saying? So that's a good place to go if you are the spies sent by Joshua into the town of Jericho. Rahab, associated with sex work, and is incorporated into the people of Israel after they conquer the city, destroy the walls, right? All that, and take everybody hostage. She and her family are protected because she hangs a red thread outside her window. They protect her. So we have Tamar, who's in the storyline because she's some form of sex scandal, highlighted because of that, because she's an outsider. Rahab, an outsider who's included in the Israelite people, and that's another piece of the story in terms of, in Joshua, she is narrated as being very aware of how their God is mighty and all this stuff, and she wants to be devoted to Yahweh, right? It's good propaganda, whether or not it's true. So Rahab is taken in. Boaz, father of Obed, by Ruth. And so I don't know what you know about Ruth's story, but one of the things, there are many things about Ruth's story that I think are really interesting and compelling. One of my favorite early ones was when someone showed me what's going on for Ruth and the other people who were picking the harvest, right? Who are harvesting. It parallels realities for people today who do the majority of the harvesting of produce in this country. And people tend to be migrant workers, and their lives they're kind of living in a what am I trying to say? Their lives are hanging in the balance. They don't have a whole lot of security. There's a lot of instability when you're traveling a lot to try to feed your family and make money, and you're not making a whole lot of money to pick the produce. And there are actual threats on your life, either in terms of rape or some form of abuse, exploitation, harm in the fields themselves and afterwards where people stay and spend the night in between picking. So there's an interesting parallel going on in Ruth's story for us today there. In the story, Boaz says, I'm telling my men not to bother you. Why don't you tell them not to bother anyone? But anyway, Ruth is special. And then, of course, as most people know, Naomi ends up pimping out Ruth to give both women some security, right? So she tells her to basically, it's like what's the song? What's the Reba McEntire song? Here's your one chance, baby, don't let me down. Here's your one chance, don't let me down, right? Like, put on your best dress and your favorite perfume and go down to the threshing floor and wait for him to pass out, and then go put yourself where it's helpful for him and do whatever he tells you. And she does, right? So Ruth is in this story not because she's this great matriarch, but because she's also a foreigner and she's also associated with some sort of untowardness sexually, because she spends the night with him on the threshing floor and in the morning he pays her with some barley. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, that happens in the story. And then few generations later, we have David was the father of Solomon by she of Uriah. Not even getting a name on that one, but we all know it's well, many of us know who grew up with these traditions that it's Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba, who was out bathing, right? Perhaps cleansing after the end of her period. And he sees her, wants her, sends for her, has sex with her, sends her home, and she tells him she's pregnant. Like, there's no space in there for her to have a voice in any of that. And when he finds out she's pregnant, he finds a way to try to have her husband come home and pretend that it's his, and he won't play along because he's a good soldier. And so then David has him killed instead. That's as you do, right? So here we are. Bathsheba is in the mix, but she's in the mix. And after David has her husband killed, David then has her brought over and included it with his other women, taken in, I suppose you could say. But that first child of theirs is killed, according to the narrative, because of what David has done. And it's not clear if what David has done is which part is the problem, according to the storyline. And this is a total tangent, but I can't help myself. What's fascinating to me is what I think of as one of the most powerful psalms in the book of the Psalter. Psalm 51 is a psalm of repentance, and it is attributed to David or to his life story. But in the story, in the psalm, David is saying to God, I have against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. I find that a really important misrepresentation of reality, because in my understanding of the world, at least, David sinned, if you want to use that language at all, David sinned against Bathsheba by forcing her to have sex with him, by raping her. Okay. David sinned against Uriah by doing this to Uriah's woman, while Uriah, who was a Hittite, is fighting for him. I mean, come on, right? That whole story started as, in the springtime when it's time to go to war, David decides to hang back and not go out into the battlefield. Like, we just know something bad's going to happen. And then I'm getting to it, Constellation Pegasus. And then she is taken into David's, womenhood. Like, there are several women who qualify as wives, but they're not called that, but the English calls them that. But anyway, he has multiple women who are his wife status women. And so the punishment to David for whatever this is he's done wrong, and it's not clear that it's because he had an affair. It seems that it's because he killed Uriah. It's not entirely clear. But the punishment for that is that the child is killed, right? That apparently God kills the child after it's born. And it is devastating to David, which is a lovely thing to see, that the man has some sort of human feelings. I do start to wonder if he's a bit of a sociopath otherwise, but I'm sorry, but it's true. And because he just uses people left and right. It's not a pretty story. But why is it that Bathsheba is not being like, nobody's talking about what's been happening to her? She's forced into the situation. Somebody else killed, like the man who has raped her kills her own man, and then he takes her in. Like, do you really want to be Bathsheba right now, having to be forced into that relationship with that man? And then the child that caused this whole mess is then killed by God to punish David? I'm pretty sure that's a punishment to Bathsheba as well. Thank you very much. She is the one getting the very short end of the stick multiple times, being beaten up with it, really. I don't know. Like, let's play with a whole bunch of metaphors. And it's the second son, the second child they have together, that is Solomon. I just get so fed up with the way women are treated in these texts and in these places. And so the she of Uriah is mentioned in Matthew chapter one in the genealogy. So we have 4 foreign women. Bathsheba is a Hittite, right? Rahab is Canaanite, she's from Jericho. Ruth is a Moabite of all people, right? Remember the story from Genesis 19 when Lot's 2 daughters essentially get pregnant with their own father? That's an incestuous origin story to belittle the Ammonites and the Moabites, who are 2 groups of people who live very close geographically to what become the Israelites. So Ruth is a Moabite of all peoples, right? Mm, but she's brought in as well. So we have 4 women, foreign, they're not Israelite, who are named in this genealogy. And so what in the world could possibly be the reason for that, right? And I want, before I answer that, or you might have your own ideas, and that's great. But before I address that, I also, oh gosh, I'm tired and not feeling well, and I just lost my own train of thought. We're talking about genealogies, and we're talking about why. Oh, right. So to highlight what's part of what's going on here is that Mark's gospel opens with Jesus getting baptized by John in the Jordan River. We don't have a birth narrative in the oldest gospel. So the first one that we know of that was written down is Mark's gospel. It's the shortest, it's only 16 chapters. And it has a flavor to it, like like the author was in a hurry, and there's all kinds of potential reasons for that. But it is worth noting that the oldest gospel doesn't have a birth narrative. It doesn't have any of that stuff that Matthew and Luke have. And I suggest that you just sit with that for a moment, because ancient biography speaking wise, you only had a birth narrative if there was a story that was out there that was relevant, that said something auspicious about the child. And so that wasn't always a part of an ancient biography for someone. So the fact that that Mark's gospel doesn't have a birth narrative is actually not a big deal. It just means that the author didn't have any stories or hadn't heard any traditions or stories associated with Jesus' birth that were important enough to tell. And so he didn't. And what then becomes an issue for the people, right, is then addressed by Matthew. That's how I make sense of it. That somehow there's a story out there, or there's a question out there about where did this guy come from? Like, if he's so special, give us his parentage, tell us who he is or something, right? And one of the ways that you talk about an important man at that point in time is by referring to him as being a son of God. So Jesus being called a son of God, or being alluded to as a son of God in the Gospels, is not unique to Jesus. It's not happening for the first time in relation to Jesus. In fact, that would be a thing that was already out there in the literature or in the literary world that you would use to say something important about Jesus. So the parentage of Jesus, or the male part of that, is a question, right? And that is why we see the next gospel, I think, makes a thing of it. Like, we don't really know who his dad is, or maybe there's a question about his dad, or whatever. And of course, there is an early tradition that says that a Roman soldier is the one who impregnated Mary, Panthera. That's a pretty early tradition, which doesn't need to take on the status of canon or scripture, but I think there's an interesting element to it that, maybe it should. I believe that's a 2nd century legend. I'm not sure what's vibrating here. Anyway, why do we have 4 scandals, sex scandals, essentially, 4 stories in the genealogy that are highlighting 4 elements in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus that are highlighting an element of a sex scandal? I suggest that it is to read it through this lens of, there are questions out there about Jesus's parentage, male, the sperm donor, and that this is a way to address that. That even with all of this, God is doing something important or beyond any scandal, right? Um, I'm looking over lots of issues with these patriarchs. Yep, God goes full antinatalist for you guys are fun. Uh, let's see what else. Yep, got to that. All right, that was from a few minutes ago. Why the heck did he not ask any forgive? I know, Nitty, I know, because he was not a full mature human, not fully evolved human, right? Um, okay, who a temple prostitute? I don't think Mary has ever been claimed to be a temple prostitute, not that I know of. I'd be interested to see the source for that, or if there was an ancient source suggesting that. In fact, it's just the opposite, because of whew, boy, this just ugh, are you all aware? I just think all this stuff is so fascinating now that I don't have to, like, uphold it as belief anymore, but I used to believe it, and I look back at what I used to believe and teach people to believe and wasn't aware of all the all of the ways it all connected, but wow, it's just jacked up, right? Like, this there's an ancient belief that predates Jesus, okay? Just predates Jesus, and so be kind with people about all this, but, like, Jesus is not the first human who is claimed to have been miraculously conceived, right? Not the first male, okay? I didn't know that until I got to grad school. So there's all that. Others, the first two that pop into my mind are always Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Buddha, who is the first enlightened within a new tradition, in contrast to Hinduism. But in that story, his birth narrative is told such that his mother side, that the form of the divine takes the form of a white elephant, which is an element of Hinduism, right? And so the divine penetrates her side to impregnate her with the child that becomes Siddhartha, and of course he comes out of her side, which is a fun little early cesarean. I don't know. But Maya, right, his mother had been having sex prior to that. This was not like a virginal thing. This is a way of saying the divine has impregnated her. And the reason that ancient people said that was a way of saying the child that we're now talking about as a man, we're going to give some sort of auspicious beginning because he has done things that are God like. And so we can only imagine that that would come from a God, right? And you can even see that the first time I saw this myself was when I was in graduate school reading through the Iliad and Odyssey, and I, was mostly reading in the English, but trying to look at the Greek, and I was like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. A man who dies heroically in battle in the Iliad, right, who had previously been thought to be a bastard, is claimed posthumously to be a son of a god, because only a son of a god could do such a thing as to lay down his life like that for his brothers in battle and die such a heroic death. He must be son of a god. Everybody knew he was a human. This wasn't a question. It's just a way of saying something powerful and important, like a certificate or an award. Son of a god, right? A god must have impregnated your mother, right? So, and that happened. And that's the thing that they're doing. And the thing about Christianity that I just hate and love all at the same time is what they did with that. And I mostly hate it because of how it has impacted people's misunderstandings about sexuality and judging humans as sinful. I don't know if you can tell, I'm actually getting teary over this because this stuff really bothers me. This really bothers me how detrimental it has been over the centuries. So the Christian tradition takes this concept of a virginal birth, which is a way of saying a God impregnated her, not another human. And it's all metaphorical. It is not literal. But Christians took it literally. Jesus, it just drives me crazy. Took it literally, right? And they also had this thing here. So I need to stop talking. I need to I need to get focused because there's so much going on in my head. So many things that are connected here around this issue of sex. There's another piece of this puzzle that I haven't mentioned, so if you can hang with me with all this, and that is that all of the genuine letters of Paul have been written before we get any of the Gospels written down. And this is a thing that I feel like I'm constantly doing this mental kind of like acrobatics because people tend to read the Gospels as if they are history, as if they're telling what went down accurately. Understandable that people do that, but that's not really a fair. You're not giving the Gospels a fair chance when you do that. You're actually putting too much weight onto them, putting too much expectation of them onto them. The reason this is important is because on this conversation about sex and sexual scandals and the way the Christian tradition has taken this metaphor of virginal conception and turned it into a literal reality that people 2,000 years later are still endorsing. And they are endorsing it because the same scriptures say with God anything is possible, even though they're not really meaning, they don't even understand the whole egg and sperm thing to begin with, much less have any sort of way to be trying to say that it's actually happening without intercourse. They don't mean that when they're saying it. They really don't. But we took it, the people hearing it decided to take it that way. So the reason this is important that you understand that Paul's genuine ideas came before we get the Gospels is Paul is the one who's fucking with us, okay? Paul is the one who has heard about this guy Jesus, who's standing up for his fellow Jews, standing up for the fellow people, especially those who are being exploited, the masses, if you will. And he's just fed up with it. And there's this latest addition to the exploitation that took place during his lifetime. If we're going to posit that there's a guy named Jesus from Nazareth at all, who was born ish the year 0, maybe 4 to 6 BCE, that during his childhood, he watched this develop. He watched this change in the way taxes were collected for the empire. You didn't see that coming, did you? Where I'm talking about sex and now we're talking about taxes. I guess that's, I don't know. Anyway, but there's a reason I'm bringing this up, okay? And that's that Jesus, if we're going to posit, if we want to posit at all, a guy, okay? Let's just say that there was a guy, a Jewish man named Jesus, right? Jesus, whatever, Yeshua, whatever, right? Who was from the region of Nazareth in Galilee. Let's just posit that. And he saw what happened when the emperor in Rome got really clever and said, "I'm really tired of sending men from Rome to go collect taxes. We've got this subset of people over there in our empire who they have this thing. They have this really important festival that happens every year, and most Jews go visit Jerusalem. And you know what? That's where the head of their like people, that's where their own little government, if they want to have their own little government and they have leaders there, religious and political leaders there. Why don't we just ask them to collect taxes for us? Because people are coming to them every year. Let's just have them do it for us, right?" I don't know what was said, but that's how I make sense of it. And around the year 6 Common Era, that is what was done. And so when you have the religious leaders being asked to be the collectors of that tax for the Romans, they are put in a position, they're put in a difficult position, and then they end up exploiting that position to their best lining of their own pockets. Okay. So that when you see Jesus encountering a tax collector, it's not just because nobody likes to pay taxes, it's because of this added layer of justified or endorsed exploitation that is they have a tax to collect, right? And the significant shift for people financially, economically, that took place gradually building up, right? That it makes a whole lot of sense to me that a man in his late 20s then who has watched this get progressively worse, right? and has watched how this plays out. And he's got stories because he's watched how it happens to these families. He's watched what happens when a person can't afford to pay the tax. And so they end up having to hand over the deed to their land. And what happens next? He doesn't have to make that shit up. He's watched it happen. He has stories about tax collectors. He has stories about people starving and trying to feed their families. And this guy named Jesus of Nazareth is pulling in his own Jewish tradition, and he's saying, "You know what? Our own religious leaders are in collusion with the with the Romans and are exploiting their own people, which is a breaking of covenant." And so Jesus, a Jewish man, can connect this exploitation to the the Hebrew Bible prophets who called out the leaders and said, "You are breaking covenant because you're not taking care of your people. You're exploiting your people. Shame on you. God's going to whoop your ass, and unfortunately, everybody else along with you." And right. And so that's why the Assyrians are allowed to come down here and whoop our asses, because God is using Assyria as a chastening rod to Israel. Okay, so we have a history. He steps into this tradition, right? He steps into this Jewish tradition. It's not hard to see that and to do that. If you have any sort of compassion and compunction for justice, not hard to imagine that a Jewish man from Nazareth who watched it happen to all these people around him would step up and say, "Enough's enough," and want to try to do something about that, even though he's just a little ant who's smashed, when he gets down to Jerusalem. Not hard, right? Because they've sent more troops. They send more troops into Jerusalem when there are more Jews gathering there, because you want to make sure you keep the people from an uprising. Got to keep the lid on that shit, right? Not the first time it happened in history, right? For Jewish people with the Romans. And so it, what gets Jesus killed is justice. He's seeking to denounce injustice. He's poking the bear. He's, you know, whatever metaphor you want to use. What gets him killed is a sense of wanting something better for his people. And what Paul does with that radically eliminates a connection to economic and political justice. The belief, the things that Paul comes up with, whether inspired by God or not, as a way to take this death, the execution of a Jewish man, and to turn that into something that gives salvation into heaven for Gentiles, that is so utterly devoid of everything that got Jesus killed, that no wonder the gospel writers have got to do some quick and interesting dance moves to make sense, to bridge the gap between the guy who lived and the things that Paul made up about him and ascribed to his death and resurrection. You gotta do some serious creative writing on that one. Are you all tracking? Are you tracking with what I'm trying to say here? Because, if you read Mark's gospel without a birth narrative, he's just jumping into the fray. Jesus as a young man, he's about to do this thing. And by the way, he's teaming up, or he's kind of in the same tradition as John the Baptist, who was out there and people think of as cray cray. But let's not do that to John the Baptist. Let's talk about because then you need to say that Jesus is too, because he's being baptized by him. How about the Gospel of Mark was written as the war with Rome is like on the horizon, or they're in the midst of it or something, because you can see it happening. You can see it coming down the road, right? You can see it on the horizon. War with Rome was 66 to 70, right? And I think of Mark's Gospel as written somewhere either immediately prior to or during that time. I don't really, beyond that, I don't really care. But all of these things are connected, right? If you want to be honest about any of this, I think you need to have an understanding of why we even have the Gospels to begin with. And that is because this Jewish man named Saul has an epiphany, goes from killing Jesus's own disciples, right? And he has an epiphany of a way to just utterly shift things around. He goes off into the desert for who knows how long, works it all out, and comes back and he's got this new message. And he's bringing Gentiles into the covenant instead of going after Jesus's disciples who stood for justice, who stood for calling their own Jewish leaders back into covenant relationship with God, because they were clearly not doing that if they are exploiting the masses to their own financial benefit. That is breaking covenant 101. And have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why would Paul, Saul, whoever he was, have been threatened by that to begin with? Have you, right? I mean, why would Paul want to be killing that, squashing that? Because he was benefiting from the exploitation of the masses, because he was in cahoots with the people in the temple. How else do you explain that? And that he wants to stop this nonsense, which is actually good sense of, humanity and compassion and desiring for justice. Like that's pretty good stuff, actually. That's a, and he utterly changes his direction, changes his message, changes his MO, does something utterly different. And so that is a different conversation, longer even conversation for a different day, because that is why I have a PhD, is because this stuff is so much more complex than what most people realize, and it is all so messy. The anti-Jewish nature of what Paul set in motion, even though I don't think he necessarily meant it to, but he did. That's where it goes. That the logical conclusions of everything he said in his letters is very anti-Jewish, even though he was a Jewish man as he wrote it all, right? And he's writing it to communities who are identifying with Judaism, but they're primarily Gentiles, so they don't know what the fuck is going on, so they need some help. I mean, all of this came out of reading the genealogy. That's fascinating. So anyway, where did we leave off? I think it's important that you understand these aren't history, right? These are stories, and they were written for reasons. There are reasons for bringing them into being. They're reacting to ideas that are out there. And they're also reacting to developments of thought in the movement. And so if Paul sets in motion a new sect of Judaism with his ideas about, let's bring the Gentiles into the covenant too. And the way he does that is by focusing on the death of this executed Jew who was claimed to have been raised from the dead also. And that brings in all of these, apocalyptic ideas of the end of the world, or the revisiting of God in the near future. And that doesn't ever happen, and that gets awkward. And so you have early ideas that are very apocalyptically minded and heavily apocalyptically minded. And then the farther it gets, the longer this return takes, the less apocalyptic all the gospels become. Paul set some ideas in motion, and the faith communities have to address that. And so by the time you get to Matthew's gospel, Matthew is written after Mark, which is trying to make sense of that whole clusterfuck that Paul created, right? How do you have a Jewish man as a savior for Gentiles? And does he know that or not? How did that play out for him in his life? Because I'm sorry, but Paul made this shit up. And so how do you then depict Jesus's life living as a Jew, trying to take care of Jews? That's what makes sense in terms of that's what got him killed. And then it's also this other radically different thing. Like, how do you tell that story? How much of that story did Jesus see coming? I'm not sure that he saw any of it coming, beyond being killed by the Romans when he gets to Jerusalem, because that's just what happens when you try to speak truth to power. And then all the other stuff that Paul did with taking his death and making it salvific for Gentiles, there's no way that Jesus saw that coming. There's no way he saw that coming, right? Because Paul made that shit up. So you got to tell a story about that guy, Jesus. who didn't know what was gonna be done with the story of his death, right? You gotta tell that story. How are you gonna tell that story? You get some pretty interesting creative writing going on is what you get, and that's, we see the messianic secret playing out that way, so forth and so on. So we have an issue that's been raised about Jesus's parentage. Who was his father? And we've got this narrative that does something that says, who gives a rat's ass who his father was? He's got this strong heritage that he's been adopted into. I don't care, right? Very, very Jewish heritage. Abraham to David, and David to Babylon, and Babylon to him. And we've got this great story, and just get on board with it. Damn it. Who cares? Who cares who got Mary Prego? Oh, that was the thing I meant to bring up earlier that came up from a comment, which is, was Mary a temple prostitute? So something that question said sent me into that whole big tangent. When you get to the Christian doctrines, right, this is why this whole can of worms opened. The Christian doctrines have this really intense, and I'm sure most people know this, but I don't know that you've thought about it all, sorted it all out. But the belief in original sin, which is a reading into Genesis 2 and 3, it is not what Genesis 2 and 3 are about, I do not think personally, and I am not the only scholar of the Hebrew Bible or Newer Testament who thinks that. But the belief in the original sin, which is intimately tied, the belief itself, which is not biblical, but is read onto it. So that belief in original sin, which is tied to sex itself, that the concept of passing along a sinfulness through childbirth, and that childbearing happens because of sex. So this connection between human nature is sinful and sex is what makes that human nature perpetuated, and therefore sex itself becomes associated with sinfulness early on, 2nd century early on. And thank you, Augustine, for just driving it home. Because of that, you do have in the Christian doctrines, you have this need for Jesus to have been brought into the world not in the typical way. So there's a need that develops that kind of jumps beyond the metaphor of virginal birth that was originally intended. The virginal birth is just a way of saying this is a special guy, so obviously God conceived this child in a woman, which is a metaphor, and everybody knew it. But it's taken literally because of that weird, jacked up concept of original sin. Therefore, the man who is going to pardon us from our sins as the perfect sacrifice cannot have come into the world the usual way. He cannot be tainted by sex. And that's where we get the concept of immaculate conception, which is Jesus's mother was also conceived miraculously. It's not the same thing as virginal conception. Immaculate conception applies to Jesus's mother, because and so forth. And anyway, so you can look into all that if you want to. But there's also a story called the Proto-Evangelium of James, in which Jesus's mother, Mary, is the story of his birth. It takes place, but also, and this is where you can see ancient misunderstandings of women's bodies playing out, which goes hand in hand with all the things before this too that talk about women's bodies, and if a woman has sex for the first time, the belief that she will have to bleed, and I have a really big frustration with that, and the label of virgin itself as a man-made construct over to control women's bodies, and it's just not a thing. It's just not a thing. It is a made-up thing that is a misunderstanding of women's anatomy that is based on doing violence to women's bodies. The label and reality of virgin initially within this tradition is based on doing violence to women's bodies. Okay. And in the Proto-Evangelium of James, we see the storyteller tells us that even after Mary gives birth to Jesus, the midwife comes in and sticks her hand up Mary's vagina and says that her hymen is intact, which to them means it is whole. It is a full covering. which is impossible because women have to bleed every month and all of that jazz. And that is not what the hymen is, not a blockage. It is a lining that can be tight until it's been you can kind of loosen it. You can do some things to prepare for that first penetration. Thank you very much. Women do not have to bleed the first time they're penetrated. And I'm talking about people who have this set of things at birth or whatever. And I don't know when people have gender conforming surgeries to what extent hymens and things are well prepared for penetration. I don't know about that, to be honest. I just know that the concept, the belief that a woman has to bleed the first time she has sex because she's a virgin and she's being penetrated, and of course she's going to bleed. No, actually, that's a mishandling of a body and a really gross thing that we've inherited over the years. So Mary was far from a temple prostitute. And in fact, there's a story that goes out of its way to say she was reared in the temple. And once she started her period, you can have the blood from slaughtering animals all over the place, but you can't have the blood that indicates that a woman can bring life into the world. That can't be associated with a temple. So as soon as she starts her menarche, she's sold to Joseph, a widower in his 40s or whatever. And they claim that her feet never even touch the ground as she grows up in the temple. So no, Mary's story, whoever she was, she is protected highly in the tradition, as terms of being pure and being kept pure. So I think that there was a question about his parentage and who actually, right, where he actually came from. And so we have this really fun, I think it is fun narrative. If you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend Jane Shaberg's book, The Illegitimacy of Jesus. She wrote that. She has since died. Really lovely human being. And she was Catholic. She was a Catholic woman. She did a lot of really neat things as a human and not just as a scholar. She was a foster mother, foster parent. But when she wrote that book, The Illegitimacy of Jesus, she was teaching at a Catholic institution, and there were death threats on her life for publishing a book entitled The Illegitimacy of Jesus, right? Which is all I need to say, I suppose. And in fact, her tenure, which you aren't supposed to be able to lose your tenure in any way, shape, or form, right? That's the whole point of it. And her tenure was threatened because of that as well. But there's so many things to be said about that, but I highly recommend. It's a very academic book. It's not written for a general audience, but if you're interested and kind of like to do deep dives like that intellectually, her book is fantastic, and it looks at this very issue in Matthew's genealogy and Luke's genealogy, specifically in particular Matthew's, and talks about what's going on here. Why would these 4 women be raised? Highlighted. What does this tell us about the first century context out of which all these things are coming and the issues they're trying to address and dispel, right? Concerns they're trying to dispel. So there you have it. We have, I was going to talk about the rest of it, but we're over an hour. I didn't realize I was going to go so long today. Thank you for sticking around. I'm not quite done, but I just want to circle back to, we started just by reading the genealogy, and I wanted to talk about all these issues. And so you can see how I do care very deeply about all of these things and the way they affect people of faith today who are taught to read these things uncritically and accept them, who are taught to read with the grain of Scripture, who are taught not to ask questions about these things. And ultimately, as a biblical scholar who's interested in marriage and the Bible, the biggest takeaway, even though all of what I've said today, I have a very deep passion for and am frustrated over, what I really care about, like on a very simple level, is, have you thought through the implications of having every single genealogy except for these 4 women is just about the men, and how that impacts people psychologically for the way we talk about people and families and who's important and why we talk about men becoming fathers instead of women bringing children into the world, and how that affects how women are valued in that culture and your faith community, right? and how or why women might not be given equal status in a faith community because none of their texts suggest that they should be. Or most of their texts suggest that they shouldn't be. They're not even named for bringing children into the world, for goodness sakes, right? Um, so I care about the stuff I was talking about, but I also care about just what's happening every day in and day out. These scriptures are not honoring all of the people involved. They are honoring the men. And it is all about men and their penises and their sexual needs. Okay. So, thank you. I you're hope you got something out of this. Thank you for being here. I'm thrilled that on a Friday there were a couple dozen people who wanted to hang out with me. Like, okay, that's awesome. I love that. Thank you for that. And if you're watching this in a replay, and I'm just grateful that you found something interesting about what I'm doing. And yeah, thanks for hanging out. And I'll do my best to start to give you a heads up what we'll be talking about so you can see if you want to check in. I can't make any promises at this point, but anyway, moving forward, I have another week of this at least, right? So, yeah, thanks for being here. I will see you tomorrow.